Hello, friends. It is Monday morning. Normally, I record these video sermons for those who are going to watch them on Saturday night. But Saturday, we had an awesome work day at the church. We got the new flooring in, and many thanks to a whole bunch of people that were very helpful. Y'all worked super hard. So, if you're just connecting, that probably means that you missed being with us on Sunday. And so this is part 2 as we journey through the book of Genesis, our First Families series, looking at how do these families in the book of Genesis experience conflict? How do they handle it? And not looking at those families as a model, like, oh, this is how I should handle conflict, but looking at how does God meet people as they handle conflict in all kinds of ways. So let's jump in. Last week was Cain and Abel. There is a children's book. It's called Children's Letters to God. Fabulous little book. And in that book, a little boy named Larry writes this letter to God. He says, maybe Cain and Abel would not kill each other so much if they had their own rooms. He says, I know it works with my brother. And that opens the door to our Bible story today, which is a story of separation. And yes, separation is a step up from killing one another, which is the story we looked at last week, Cain and Abel. Separation. So it's the siblings that have separate rooms, or they get sent to their room, or it's the person or the spouse, the coworker who says, just give me a moment, give me some space. I need to settle down and simmer down. I will come back. I will be ready to come back. We'll continue the conversation. We'll keep working on it. And if only all separations were that quick and that easy, and we all know they are not. Simply put, when relationships aren't working out, people separate. It's just what they do. Separation starts with some kind of conflict, and it can be useful as a temporary kind of rethink, buffer, regroup kind of a strategy. It's definitely an alternative to killing, but it's often seen as like the only option, the only alternative, and so it becomes the new permanent solution. Now we're separated. And it's basically having you in my world is creating too much friction and too much stress, and so I'm separating from you, and there's no longer space for you in my world. And when we separate, it's basically now I don't have to see you anymore, and I don't have to put up with whatever it was that you were doing, and I don't have to try to understand you. I don't have to try to feel you. I can basically forget about you, and now my brain can relax a little bit. Whew. Out of sight, out of mind. And depending on the nature of the separation, people view it in different ways. For some folks, it's like, oh, now I can breathe a little easier. And for the folks that feel like they got forced into it, it might feel like exile. I just got sent away, and what am I supposed to do now? What's happening? Rarely, if ever, do long-term separations end with clear winners. Both sides lose. The longer I live, the more separations that I witness, the more convinced I become of this. In separation, both sides lose. It's an amputation. There aren't any winners in separations. Now, we could make a big, messy list of all the separations that touch even our church family. I told you all about a personal story of separation a few weeks back, and Well, I guess I told the folks that were in person at the service, but you have your own stories. So you have relatives who aren't invited to Christmas, or you're not invited to their Christmas, or you don't call, or they don't call. And there are friendships that fell apart. So no more barbecues or coffee dates. There are those folks who you walk into the grocery store, you're pushing your cart, you turn down an aisle, and you see someone, and you swap ends. You're like, whoa! And you head to the other end of the store to do your grocery shopping over there. It's what happened to that relationship? There are people in prison, thousands of people separated from society. There are jobs that people leave. It's like, I cannot stand this and these people. There are employees who are let go. There are people who are evicted. There are people who are deported. There are people who leave churches and drop connections, both on a personal level and on a whole church level. So there are people who are like, I don't like this and I'm out of here. And then there are whole denominations and yearly meetings and organizations that split. There are black churches and Hispanic churches, Latino, Latina, Latinx churches. There's white churches. Sadly, there are spouses and lovers who separate from one another, and divorce, and people who are left nursing wounds and trying to figure out, like, where am I going to go from here? And children who are asking, am I going to mom's or dad's for the weekend? There are children and teenagers who go through all kinds of friend drama. I don't mean to use that word negatively. It's real. And it's separation and breakups and cliques and all kinds of stuff. And then there are people that just separate themselves into all kinds of categories. Uh, Oregon Ducks, Oregon Beavers, Republican, Democrat. I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm a Mexican citizen. On and on and on. And separations can become so complicated, so messy, so traumatic that we can't see our way out of that separation, beyond that separation. And that is where God meets people. And not just us, the people on every side of the separation. Because God is the reconciling God. And so even when the separation is holding on and it's way more messy and complicated than we know how to see our way out of, God meets his children on both sides, every side of the separation, because God is the God who will ultimately reconcile all things to himself. Colossians 1:20. And we are given this ministry of reconciliation. But let's start with God. Brings us to our story. So this comes mostly from Genesis 16 and 21, although we're gathering our story from the larger picture within Genesis. And I have to share a trigger warning for anyone who has experienced any kind of trauma around sexual assault. Our Bible story today has sexual assault, rape stuff. So I'd rather tell folks that earlier than later, get into the story and someone's reliving their own stuff and unhappy that I didn't warn them. So uh, here we go. Abraham and Sarah, or Sarai, and I'll probably use the names back and forth here. Abraham's roughly 86 years old. Sarah's roughly 76. Abraham is born into a family of immigrants. They have left modern day Iraq. They end up in modern day Turkey. And that's where they spend most of their lives until God calls them to immigrate to this new land. So now they're uprooting and they're leaving relatives behind, and they spend a whole decade just constantly moving so that they can have enough grass and water for their flocks. And so they're in Canaan and the Negev and Egypt and back to the Negev and Bethel and Ai and Canaan. And they spend this decade of nomadic traveling, and that's its own saga. There's all kinds of weird stuff that happens there. God's hope with Abraham Sarah was to create this brand new people who could become this visible demonstration to embody to the rest of the world. What does it look like to turn back to God, and what does it look like to turn back to one another? What does it look like to turn back to creation? And so Abraham's little family is chosen for the sake of the world, not for the sake of the family, for the sake of the world. But as we'll see, God's plans are quickly complicated by Abraham and Sarah taking things into their own hands. So along the way, Abraham and Sarah become increasingly wealthy. They acquire flocks and herds and slaves. And life should have been good for them, but life was not good. Because, you see, God had promised Abraham to make his family into this people with as many offspring as there were stars in the sky. But the problem is that Sarah is barren. She's infertile. And in Sarah's day, that's considered Sarah's problem. And so it's like she's standing in the way of God's promise. You know, from the very beginning, God has said, go be fruitful, multiply, to Adam and Eve, to Noah, and here's Sarah. Right now to Abraham, you know, this is going to happen. And she's standing in the way. And so she's carrying this tremendous amount of distress, being childless. Years earlier, she longed for a child, but now her childbearing years are long past, and she's looking around at all of her wealth, and she's like, "Who's going to inherit this? Like one of the servant kids, or what?" The wealth that she has cannot buy fertility, and she feels like she has failed her husband, and so she did what many folks do. She took things into her own hands. She complicated things. And it's at this point that I need to introduce you to a black woman in the Bible. This black woman, she's Egyptian. To Abraham and Sarah, this black woman was not a person. She was not a name. She was Sarah's property. She was Sarah's slave. And so she's a tool. She's available to Sarah, to Abraham for anything that might be needed. Labor, sexual, medical, domestic, what have you. The slave market was an accepted part of the economy of the day. It was just like, that's a matter of fact. Historians report that slaves during much of the ancient world outnumbered free people. So what's this name of this black woman in our story? Well, in the entire book of Genesis, if we're asking Abraham and Sarah, we are not given a name because they only call her slave woman, slave woman. But the writer of Genesis tells us her name. Her name is Hagar. Now, how old is this slave woman? How old is Hagar when she became a slave? Was she born into slavery? Was she sold into slavery by impoverished parents? What happened within the land? Was it war? Was it famine? And it forced them to sell their child? Was she kidnapped by slavers? And how many times has she been bought and sold before she came to Abraham and Sarah? How many times has she been beaten or raped before she came to Abraham and Sarah? Had she ever known love? Had she ever known a family? Had she ever known a support system, a home? We don't know. Because we only have these little, it's like these little fragments of Hagar's story that show up in the book of Genesis. We don't know Hagar's entire story. Sarah's barren, she's infertile, and so in the same breath that she blamed God for not letting her have children, Sarah offered this body of her slave to Abraham so that Abraham could sleep with this slave woman. And Sarah said, well, perhaps I can build a family through her, this slave woman. And so Sarah transfers her hope for the future to her slave's body. Now, there was no such thing as asking for consent, asking for permission, and there's no record in Genesis of any kind where Abraham and Sarah have a conversation with Hagar, the slave woman. The customs of the time said, yeah, a man can have a kid with a slave, and in the event that there are no children, that child can even carry on. They could become an heir. They can carry on the family name and inherit. Now, how much of the plan, did Hagar know? How much of the plan did Hagar understand the first time that Abraham tried to impregnate Hagar? Like, how many times did it take before anyone knew that Hagar was pregnant? And was that the end of it? Did Hagar struggle? Did she try to accept it? Either way, she's required here to perform at the will of her owners, her masters. Now, in our day, when people make choices about what's going to happen to someone else's body sexually, we call that assault. We call that rape. And so we would understand experiences like this experience as trauma. You know, your brain just it turns your memories into shattered glass. It's like uh, my life just got. But in the ancient world, these stories are just matter of fact. Yeah, that's what happens. So to Abraham and Sarah, Hagar is a body. She's a womb with legs. She's an object, a possession, a tool. You use it to accomplish your goals, and then you probably discard it later when it's no longer valuable. Now, what emotions could Hagar even afford to allow herself to connect with and still be able to survive, still be able to cope with life? And what emotions did she just have to bury? A woman, a black woman, sex slave now in a world where no one sees her, no one asks her, no one regards her, no one feels her feelings, no one understands her. In time, Hagar became pregnant. And so this plan of Sarah's, I'll have a child through my slave, it was a success. It worked. And so Hagar's belly begins to grow. And as it begins to grow, Sarah begins to feel humiliated because here's this visible symbol of her inability to have a child. But it affected Hagar differently as well because she began to recognize her own dignity. It's look, I'm capable of something that my master is not capable of. Having a child, the one thing that she wants to be able to do, she cannot do, and I can do it. And so Hagar began to despise Sarah for everything that she had done to her. Now, Sarah, rather than blame herself, or she'd already blamed God, now she blames Abraham. She says, Abraham, you're wrong. You're responsible for the wrong that I am suffering. And I put my slave into your arms. Now that she knows she's pregnant, she is despising me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Now, rather than take any responsibility, Abraham says, your slave is in your hands. Do whatever you think is best. Basically, well, she's your problem. You deal with her, and I don't really want to have a part of this. Can you hear the echo from Cain and Abel? It's Cain's. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sister's keeper? Am I the keeper of the woman I just impregnated? That's what is the echo. Now, to Sarah, this meant permission has been granted. Permission granted to mistreat Hagar. We don't know exactly what Sarah did to Hagar, but we know it pushed Hagar beyond the point of desperation, beyond the last straw. So we have to ask, like, what is that? What does it take beyond rape to force a slave to finally flee into the desert? Whatever it was that Sarah did to Hagar, it felt worse than rape. It was something that made her say, I this is the thing I can't take. And so there Hagar is. She has literally nowhere to turn in the entire world. She lives in this world without safety nets. She's pregnant, she's desperate, she's out of options, she flees to the desert. This is the height of her trauma so far. It's separation. She's a person out on the very edge of survival, out on the margins. A woman in a world of male power, an Egyptian in a non Egyptian world, a slave in a wealthy family, no necessities out there in the desert. But she's also strong. And so this pregnant black slave woman is resilient and she makes it through the desert. Just kind of astonishing. Makes it through the desert all the way to where the border of Palestine butts up against the Egyptian border, the region of Shur, and she's sitting by a spring when the angel of the Lord finds her. She's from Egypt, remember, so she's almost home. And this angel finds her, the angel of the Lord, and that's right, the very first person that the angel of the Lord ever visits in the Bible is a black woman slave. And the angel of the Lord says to her, this nameless woman, Hagar. Hagar, slave of Sarai. It's the first person in the story. See, we know her name because the narrator's telling us in Genesis, but it's the first person in the story to call her by her given name, Hagar. And the angel recognizes right away this situation that she's fleeing: slavery, mistreatment, rape. And the angel recognizes who is hurting her: slave of Sarai. Sarai is the one you're running away from. And so this conversation begins, as God begins all conversations with people who are traumatized, which is with a question, with listening. It's allowing us to articulate what has happened to us and what our plans are. So the angel says, where have you come from and where are you going? Now, I wonder, when was the last time that anyone had ever asked Hagar a question? You see, questions were not a luxury given to slaves. Slaves receive commands. That's what they take, because no one cares about their story, their experiences, their feelings, their plans, their hopes, their dreams. They're not allowed to have plans. So, where have you come from? Where are you going? And I wonder how many hours it took to answer that question. The angel wanted to know it all. Now, when someone with that many years of experiences of pain, anger, confusion, terror, panic, trauma, loneliness is finally given a place where they can uncork that bottle and let a little bit of that out. Like if Hagar was able to uncork that and start the conversation, how long did it take before she was done? Just it's spilling out. How many boxes of tissue did the angel have tucked away here? Like what did it feel like for Hagar to have a place and a space to be able to say, this is where I'm coming from. This is what I plan to do, where I'm going. It all came down to separation. And it's fascinating. The part of the conversation that is recorded uh, is that Hagar, the only option she knows is separation, and it's who she's fleeing. She's running away from her oppressor, Sarai. It doesn't matter where she's going. She doesn't answer the question with I'm moving towards something. It's I'm moving away from someone. It's I'm getting away from Sarai. Now, after she finishes telling her whole story, the angel of the Lord says to her, go back. Go back to your mistress and submit to her. Now, that's a statement that makes anyone who's lived through any level of abuse or trauma, like it makes the hair on the back of their neck raise. And they're shouting. They're like, no, no, don't do it. Don't go back. And this story in the Bible should not be our go-to story when people are asking questions like, well, should I return to an abusive relationship, or should slaves be sent back to their masters? Moses later writes in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, he says, so if a slave has taken refuge with you, do not, keyword, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and in whatever town they like, and do not oppress them. So Moses would be on team, yeah, don't send her back. It's interesting. The Bible has these two stories that come from the same location, the wilderness of Shur. Remember, that's where Hagar is. So in the first story, the angel of the Lord is saying, go back to your master. Go back to this situation that you were in. In the second story, it's the Exodus story. So it's God is liberating his people from slavery, and they've just crossed the Red Sea, and it's like, yeah, don't go back to Egypt. Keep going. So what's going on here? Well, a couple things that help. I don't know if we'll solve it, but a couple things that help us understand the fullness of the story. There's a subtle Hebrew wordplay is one of them. So Sarah has not treated Hagar with respect. And that same root word is used to invite Hagar to take that high road of conduct and treat Sarah with respect. So the way Jesus says that concept is love your enemies. The way the Apostle Paul says that concept is do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Now you may say that's not good enough for me. Don't send her back. Fair enough. That's not all. The the angel of the Lord keeps talking to Hagar, and the way that the angel of the Lord talks to Hagar is like she's the head of the household, the head of the family. So there's that's another really important, interesting piece. So the angel of the Lord says, I will increase your seed, your descendants, so much that they will be too numerous to count. Now we could read right over that real fast, but it's worth noting. The angel's using I'm going to use a gross word here, literally your semen to Hagar, your semen. Like this is very much man language in a world that is ruled completely, dominated by men. Men are the ones with all the power. And the angel's using that kind of language with Hagar, someone who isn't even considered a person, using this language of head of household. Like she's going from way down here to way up here. Uh, Being treated like she is the head of her household now, and being told, Sarai's not going to shape your future. Abraham's not going to shape your future. God is going to shape your future. And there's only one woman in the Bible who receives a promise like this, where God promises to give this woman numerous descendants. That woman is Hagar. Uh, Hagar is also told that this little baby that is growing in her womb will actually be her baby. And that's another thing that we might skip right over. The the way that this is expected to go, she's been forced as a slave into surrogacy. We're going to use your body, we're going to use your womb, we're going to make a baby. With this background thought, when the baby is born, it will be taken from you, ripped from your arms, given to Sarai. It will be her baby. We'll go on from there. And in fact, just a musing, a wondering would be, is that why Hagar eventually ran away? Was it, I can't bear someone taking, I have this child growing inside of me, and I can't bear this thought of someone just taking that child away from me. And so, how does it hear to be told? How does it feel? How does it sound to be told, this child will be your child? The angel of the Lord goes on to talk about how strong this child will be. um, against all oppressors. Now, in our day, people might read that and think, yeah, oh, yeah, the descendants of Hagar or Ishmael are fighters. But to read it from Hagar's perspective, imagine how good it sounds to a mother who has only known oppression that my son is going to be against all oppressors. Does it sound different at all? The angel tells Hagar that she will live beyond this day, out there in the desert running away. She's going to give birth to a healthy boy. His name will be Ishmael, which means God will hear because the Lord has heard your misery. A very personal message there. She's pregnant because of something that has been forced upon her, and now God is acknowledging her trauma and her pain. And even in her child's name, like every time she says his name, it's this reminder God has heard your misery. And so Hagar, the strong, resilient black woman, has this new vision of her life, her future, her legacy, her dignity, who she is in this world, a new vision of Sarai and Abraham, and a new vision of God. And it's like now she has space in her life for Sarai, this person she was running away from. And so that desperation gives way to hope. It's like, oh, maybe I can return. And so she responds by doing something that no other person in the Bible does. She responds by giving God a name, El Roi, which is, you are the God who sees me. But that word see, it's got a whole depth of meaning. It's like, you regard me and feel me and perceive me and understand me. You get me at the deepest level. And naming is a big deal because in Hagar's day, you can only name someone who's of lower status than you. And Hagar is like at the bottom of her world. Like who's lower than Hagar? And so here she is at the bottom, and here's the God of the universe allowing the person at the bottom to to name him, which means it's like God is coming underneath Hagar, and Hagar gets to name God. You get me. You see me. So Hagar returns. She goes back to Abraham and Sarah, and her son, that little baby, Ishmael, is born. And years go by, and Ishmael becomes a teenager. About 14 years later, Abraham and Sarah become pregnant. So Sarah's 90. Abraham's about 100. Can you imagine? I can't. But they have this little baby, Isaac. And so now Ishmael has this half brother, Isaac. Um, and in this big, messy way, they are all family. So, a few years after Isaac was born, Abraham and Sarah throw this big party because Isaac is weaned. And so, throw a celebration. And at the party, Sarah sees Ishmael, Hagar's son, do something to mock Isaac, her son. Something to make fun of him, make sport of him, and something inside of Sarah snaps. Now, it's not just about the making fun of. It's about something much larger. It's about the inheritance. Uh, she is looking at these two boys, and she's realizing I don't have space for both of them. Mesopotamian inheritance law says that the inheritance goes to the primary wife's firstborn son, so that'd be Isaac. But Egyptian inheritance law says the inheritance goes to the firstborn son no matter, even if it's a slave woman. So that'd be Ishmael. And so, I mean, these guys have been nomadic travelers for a decade. Whose inheritance law are they going to go with? Who's the inheritance going to go to? And so Sarah is going to make sure. She says to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, because that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son, Isaac. You hear the way she's talking? Ishmael is Abraham's son, family. But now Sarah is defining Hagar and Ishmael as that slave woman and her son, not family at all. You remember Cain's question, am I my brother's keeper? Well, Sarah's answer is no, separation. And Abraham is distressed. He's caught in the middle. And sometimes that's the way separations feel. It's like, I have connections to both sides here. Remember, separations don't have winners, they have losers. And so, in great sadness, Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away out into the desert to a life of fending for themselves. He gives them a backpack of food, he gives them a canteen of water, and that's the breaking of a family. That's well over 15 years that Hagar spent with Sarah and Abraham down the toilet. Now, you could call it emancipation. She was a slave, so you could say, well, no, this is a good thing. She just got emancipated. What what does she have to work with in a world that puts her at the very bottom? The reason she's being forced to leave is because Sarai doesn't have space in her life for Hagar and her son. And so Hagar has become the slave woman that is just old, useless garbage, the tool that's no longer needed, and she's thrown out, homeless, exiled out in the desert, once again, on the margins of society, facing death. So out there in the desert, miles, perhaps days into the hot desert, Hagar and Ishmael run out of water. The sun is beating down. Their lips are beyond chapped. Their skin is sunburned to the max. Their bodies start to break down. It's heat stroke that's starting to set in, and their hearts are racing, vomiting, headache won't let up, confusion sets in. It's hard to breathe as their body temperature soars, and they lay down under this bush to try to find some shade. I can imagine Hagar like wondering, where is the God who sees and hears? And Ishmael is crying out. He's not even making any sense anymore. And Hagar can see that Ishmael doesn't have long to live. Death is near. And there's nothing she can do. She can't bear to watch her only family in this world just die. And so dizzily she staggers away. She falls on the dirt and she's sobbing. She just can't watch. And all the pain just comes pouring out in these violent shakes. And in that moment, she hears the same voice from 15 years ago, the angel of the Lord, the God who sees, the God who hears. She hears this voice. It's, what's the matter? What's the matter, Hagar? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up. Take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. And God opens Hagar's eyes beyond the heat stroke, and there she sees a well of water. And she's able to stumble to the well and fill her canteen, give Ishmael a drink, and God meets them there in their separation. And so they survive. They make it through that day, make it through the next day, and the desert becomes the place where God meets them when they have no home. We're told that God blessed this son that Abraham and Sarah had excluded from the family, that God was with this son Ishmael as he grew up. And when Ishmael was old enough, Hagar returned to Egypt, her homeland, and she found a wife for Ishmael. Now that's head of household kind of activity. That's what in that day, that's what the man of the house did. And there's Hagar as the head of the household. After all these years, Hagar, the black woman, finally returns home. Stronger in some ways, much weaker in others, more resilient, primarily more trusting in God, this God who sees, this God who hears. Just a final wrap up from this story. So here we are. we find ourselves living in all these different forms of separation today. I'm living with separations. You're living with separations. God allows separations to happen, and they are messy. And when they happen, sometimes we view God as only being on our side, only working with our concerns. We view those folks who we separated from, whoever they are, as kind of the villain. It's, well, may the Lord judge between us. Sarah says that. Or others, they just stop thinking about those folks. It's out of sight, out of mind. So I no longer need to feel you, understand you, see you, get you. And then there's the folks who feel like I I got forced into this separation, and has God abandoned me? And then there's the folks caught in the middle. Like, I have connections to both sides. God is the God who works with people on every side of the separation. That's what this story shows us. It's when one side or the other is excluded from the family, God isn't forced into taking sides. Like, choosing one son doesn't mean excluding the other son or daughter from the family. It's the same as the parable of the prodigal son. God doesn't stop blessing people on both sides of separations when separations happen, because God longs for reconciliation. Separation is not the end of God's story. And so these separations in our lives that cause us to say, man, this is too messy, this is too painful to figure out. The good news says, this is Colossians 1, it's, for God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in Jesus, and through Jesus to reconcile to himself all things. Yes, even my things, these messy things I can't figure out, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So, I want to end with a story that's not exactly in the Bible, but I definitely see it there. It's after the great judgment, after everyone has faced Jesus the judge, which is good news that Jesus is the judge. They've faced themselves. They've faced how they have not loved God, how they have not loved their neighbor as themselves. And it's the new heaven and earth, the reconciliation that must occur directly within those moments, because it says there will be no weeping. And so I have this vision of Hagar in the new heaven and earth and Sarah. And they walk towards one another, and they're both weeping. And they see fully how they did not love one another, and they embrace. And they're just squeezing one another. There's so much love in how they see how they hurt one another. And Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael, Abraham just comes and wraps his arms around the both of them. He sees how he hurt them. And Isaac and Ishmael are right in there, and Jesus is wrapping his arms around the entire family. And all that weeping turns into great guffaws of laughter and love. And that's the God who reconciles the world to himself is at work in my separations and in your separations, because God gets me, God sees me, and God gets and sees the people who right now there's separation with. And we are given this ministry, 2 Corinthians 5, that we are given this ministry to be with God in this ministry of reconciliation, the reconciling God. Love you, friends.